A very warm welcome to Mr. Matthew Friedman, who was awarded in Nepal in 1994, a modern slavery expert, whose LinkedIn stories are very famous, who's a keynote speaker, and is the author of Where Was You, Afghan Girl, and The Art of Inspirational Speaking. We are here to welcome today on the speaking on the topic of modern slavery, and the main thing is identifying modern slavery, what it is, because a lot of people even don't know what modern slavery it is. So a very warm welcome, sir.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm thrilled to have this chance to talk to you.
Thank you once again. So, dear Matt, what is modern slavery?
Well, maybe the best way of describing this would be to just give you an example. So a 15-year-old boy from Cambodia is told that if he gets on a boat in Thailand, that it'll go out for a couple of months and the boat will catch a bunch of fish and then he'll come back and get a lot of money. He goes to the boat, gets on the boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out for 4 years. This poor guy will end up working 14, 15 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten, he gets tortured. The only food he'll eat the entire time he's there is rice and fish. They give him strong stimulants to basically get him to work. If he gets injured, if he gets sick, they throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, the boat comes in and he gets nothing. So basically what modern slavery is slavery, where a person loses control of their life. They can't make decisions for themselves. They're held either through threats against them or their family or debt, where somehow there's an indebtedness that is generated and the person can't leave that situation. For most of us, we hear this in the form of sex trafficking, where women and girls are forced into prostitution, but there's also a lot of people in what's called forced labor as well. And so this is what is called modern slavery these days. In fact, there are more slaves today than any other time in history.
Yes, since you are the only person who's raising the topic of modern slavery, and a lot of people around the globe are not aware that there exists modern slavery as it happened in the pre-modern era. It was very open, right, about the slavery issue. So I wanted to ask, how did you pick up this interest or this passion or this pursuit for the humanity to expose modern slavery? How did you pick on this?
Okay, so I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer and my job was to make people healthier in that country. At that time, I had the HIV/AIDS portfolio, and we were finding girls that were 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. Now, we couldn't understand how that could be because it's a very conservative culture. So we went to go and interview the women and the girls, and we heard the same story over and over again. A human trafficker, usually a guy around 20 years old, would go into the village. He'd flash a bunch of money around. He'd say he's looking for a wife. I don't want an urban wife. I want a village wife. He'd find a girl 12 years old, befriend her, go to the family and say, I'd like to marry your daughter. They're thinking, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, he's going to take care of our daughter, he's going to take care of us. A couple of days later, they go through a traditional wedding ceremony. After that, he goes to the family and says, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu where I live, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But instead of taking her to Kathmandu, he takes her to Mumbai, to the red light district where the brothels are. He gets there, he puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here, I'll be back in a few minutes. She's thinking, wow, where are we? Who are all these people? Why are they standing around? Why are they dressed that way? Please don't leave me. He says, it's okay, I'll be right back. He then goes to the madam to get the $500 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding and he hands the wedding pictures over. He then leaves to go back to Nepal to do this again and again, maybe 40, 50 times in a year. The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me and you're going to be with 20 guys a day, every day. You can imagine her shock. No, my husband loves me. No, that's what happens. When she comes to internalize what's going on, many of the girls say, I will kill myself before I do those shameful things. I'm a good Hindu girl. He then takes out the photographs of the wedding and says, is this your mom, your brother, your father? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. To make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You bring in a couple of professional rapists, and over a 2-day period of time, they rape this poor girl maybe 20 or 30 times until she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. After that, she's put on the line. She's with 20 guys a day, every day, for about 2 years until she basically burns out. She doesn't have much spirit left. She's diseased. She doesn't have any emotional sense anymore, so they throw her out on the street. So I was hearing this over and over again, but I didn't understand this until I actually went to Mumbai. Your government invited me to do public health checks. I had a police officer with me, went into one of the brothels, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw me, saw an opportunity, literally ran up, wrapped herself around me and said, save me, they're doing terrible things to me. I looked at the police officer and said, we need to get this girl out of here. I said, we can't do that. I said, what are you talking about? You're a cop. He says, well, if we try to leave right now, we'll both be killed. To make a long story short, we left, we came back with more police, but of course she was gone. Now I tell that story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-olds that say, when I grow up, I want to be an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to be. But every once in a while, we are faced with a test. That was my big test. I should have helped that girl somehow. I failed miserably, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. So I just surrendered to the fact that now that I know about this, this is what I'm going to do with my life. And 30 years later, here I am talking to you.
Okay, it's so glad that you really found your calling. And with God's grace, your calling is a benefit to so many around the world that you have helped so far. And not only the ones you have helped physically, but your stories are even inspiring. I read your story of Sushma and Hina and then Prem, the vegetable seller. And these stories,
Yes.
literally shakes up the person. Listening those stories makes one cry. So, Matt wanted to ask, is the situation only bad in India, or how bad is it around everywhere else?
Well, I'll start off by saying that there's 40 million people in this situation. Out of that number, 15 million of them are in forced marriages that are not really marriages. They basically force a girl into a marriage to take care of an older person, or to basically use her in the house and so forth. So it's a form of modern slavery. 25 million of that is associated with forced labor. And out of that, 4.8 million women and girls are in forced prostitution. Now, India has a huge population, but they also have a lot of people in modern slavery. 18.3 million Indians are identified as being in a modern slavery. And in terms of the real terms, that's the highest number, but percentage of population, it isn't. There are other countries that have much higher percentages. But part of it is that India, has certain parts that are very modern, very sophisticated, but there's other parts that haven't really developed significantly. And so the same systems and procedures that exploited people 200 years ago are still there. And so as a result of that, you have a large number of people in that situation.
Okay. So you say that we have 40 million people who are still there into modern slavery?
In the world, 40 million in the world, yes.
Out of that, 18 million are in India.
That's according to the slavery index in the United Nations estimations.
Okay. Because now the governments around the world are pretty high tech and talking a lot of big stuff, right? So what do you think are the global parameters or the global laws that are there in force? I'm sure in the West, they might be enough to stop human trafficking, right? There might be human laws.
Actually, okay, so this is the very sad part of the story. There are 40 million people in modern slavery. A new slave enters every 4 seconds somewhere in the world. 25,200 people enter per day. But last year, out of 40 million people, with all the NGOs and the governments and the United Nations combined, only 108,000 people were rescued. That means 0.2% of the victims around the world were helped, not even a 1%. So that's partly because the profits generated from modern slavery are 150 billion US dollars. If you take that number and multiply it times what the exchange rate is in rupees, you can see how big that number is. It's huge. Yeah. The amount of money to fight this is about 350 million US, or 0.2% 3% of the profits. So the amount of money that is earned is huge. The amount of money that's available to address this is tiny. And that's the reason why we aren't hitting even 1%.
Okay. So thanks for telling that for every 4 seconds a slave enters. These are the numbers that you're speaking up, because you know what can be measured can be managed, because so far we really never know how big the problem is. Okay, sir, you have spoken about the myths of child sex in some of your article, right? One of the major cause of human trafficking is the myths related to child sex. Are these myths related only to the Asian countries? What are the myths that force people to force the children into sex slavery?
Well, there are 3 myths that we find in Africa and all over Asia, both South Asia and Southeast Asia, when it comes to child sex trafficking. Number 1 is that if you have sex with a child, you can't get a sexually transmitted disease because they're so young and they're so healthy. That's not true. In fact, because the girl is so undeveloped, chances are there will be blood associated with the sex act, and the possibility of getting AIDS or something else actually increases. So that's myth 1. Myth 2 is that if you have a sexually transmitted disease like syphilis or gonorrhea or HIV/AIDS, and you have sex with a child, she will cure you. This is not true. Okay. In fact, once again, it's the opposite of that. The third myth in certain locations around the world is that if you have sex with a child, you can get some of her youth and vitality transferred to yourself because there is some type of transfer. Obviously, that's not true. There's no such thing as this type of thing. So that's why we see in certain locations that very young girls are made available to various communities because they believe these myths to be real.
Yeah, I think the first thing would be to break those myths that are associated with it. Okay, so since since you have been now speaking about child sex that's related, what are the other major works that are associated with human trafficking that is so lucrative for the people to have these modern slaves?
Well, I mean, we see it in the fishing industry. We see it in certain manufacturing that doesn't pay much. We see it as domestic helpers in households. We see it in construction sites. So wherever there's an opportunity to take advantage of somebody because there's nobody really preventing that from happening, you will find the possibility of human trafficking or forced labor taking place.
So what level can this human trafficking be really lessened or stopped? As a now you're trying to raise the awareness through the world. So at what level can the normal individual that is involved, or the normal human or the mankind is involved, so that this trafficking should be stopped, and how?
Okay, so I mean, there are non-government organizations that run shelters and do prevention activities and all of that. But let me just say one thing about that. There's about 20,000 people like me around the world who fight this. The number of criminals is about 500,000, 500,000. So 20,000 people fighting it, 500,000 people taking advantage of other people. So you can see the disadvantage we have. So the reason why I post on LinkedIn every day is I am trying to raise awareness among the people who are on LinkedIn, the professional people, to help them to understand this is what the issue is. This is how it plays out, and to offer very concrete suggestions on what they can do to help. The first thing that's needed is we need to raise awareness. Most people don't know about this topic. If you don't know about a topic, you're not going to care. And if you don't care, you're not going to do anything. So awareness raising is really important. And so like you sought me out because you saw my LinkedIn posts. You're doing this podcast. You'll help people to hear this. You are doing your part by doing this. Other people can take this podcast and amplify it to others, read my stories, read other people's stories. When they get information, pass it along. The second thing you can do is to volunteer. There's a lot of organizations, amazing organizations across India who do very good work. You can go in and you can actually work in their office, or nowadays, oftentimes you can even volunteer from home. Most of my volunteers just do computer searches for me. They collect information. They don't have to come to my office in order to do this. So using your professional skill as a banker, as a lawyer, as a doctor, as an academic person, apply that to addressing your volunteerism. You can donate or raise money for organizations. During COVID, a lot of the money was diverted in different directions. There's a lot of organizations that need money to do prevention. They need money to basically set up those shelters, to help the girls after they get out, those types of things. All of these things, if everyone did one thing, but 10 million people did one thing, it would add up to something quite big. So this kind of contribution of people saying, after they read these stories, that this is wrong, it shouldn't exist, this has to stop, then we have to get them over the line to actually do something afterwards.
Yes, thank you for telling me about that. So, I read your post on how you met a human trafficker, and, he gave you a thing that, we are the people with no rules, and you 20,000 people who are the activists against human traffickers are only 20,000, and you guys are following rules, and we are the people with no rules. So you are 20,000 people following rules, and they are 500,000 plus not following any rules and ethics. So the problem gets even bigger. Okay, so now coming back, because your stories are really heartwarming, and they are making up a change. I just cannot get over the story of Sushma and Hina that I read, besides that of Prem. So how do you do your story collection? I mean, that's really wonderful. Those stories are very compassionate. How do you collect your stories from the ground? Do you go interview
Well,
them?
I mean,
or how many stories
I
do you
live,
keep listening a day so that you select the best out of them?
no, actually, I mean, I lived in South Asia for 17 years. And I lived in Nepal for 8 years, 5 years in Bangladesh. And if you add up the amount of time I spent in India, it was probably collectively about a year. So many of my stories were based on the time that I was living and working in South Asia. And the reason why I collected so many stories, I collected about 400 of them, was because I was going to write a book. And I wanted to basically have real information. So I interviewed trafficking victims from India, from Bangladesh, from Nepal. I interviewed madams, I interviewed pimps, I interviewed human trafficking responders, I interviewed all of these people. And so I continued to collect and analyze this data. And then when I went to live in Bangkok and work in China and Vietnam and all those countries, I continued to collect these stories. Because the real experts in human trafficking are not me. They are the people who have been trafficked and the people who are doing the trafficking. If you can understand their story and how they got involved in it, then you can understand what needs to be done to address this situation. So from these stories, I pick a story and I get it down to the 530 words that you have to get it down to put it into LinkedIn. But there's so much more of that story that doesn't make it into this. But you get enough of it to get a flavor and a taste for what happened to those boys, those girls, those men, those women, those victims of human trafficking.
I'm sure your work must be very challenging and risky. What are the various challenges or threats that you feel that you might have faced during your years trying to prevent the human trafficking out here in Southeast Asia?
Well, I mean, there have been times when I've been threatened by the gundas and the pimps. When I was in Nepal, I would get phone calls saying that we are going to throw acid on you and your family. I've been in situations where I literally had to run for my life because people were chasing me. So those situations have existed. You're talking about people who are very notorious. They are extremely violent, not only to anyone who tries to go after their business, but to the people who they exploit. You know, the number of women and girls, for example, in the brothels in India that have been beaten to death is huge, or have been diseased to death is huge. And, these people just don't care. All they want is the money, and that's all they're going to be working for. They don't see the victims as even being human. They see them as being subhuman, and that's part of what we're up against. if you're dealing with people who have no consciousness, no conscience, no set of morals or values, and they'll do anything just to basically bring power and money to themselves, what do? In fact, I had a situation where I was in Vietnam, and this guy contacted me and said, I'd like to talk to you. I heard you work for the United Nations, and this happens now and then. So I met him at a restaurant, and he seemed very well-educated, well-dressed, very charming, very charismatic. For an hour, I talked about my work, and then I turned to him and I said, well, what's your story? And he says, well, I'm a human trafficker. I said, excuse me? So yeah, I'm a human trafficker. I never met somebody like you. I wanted to meet them. You know, it's so nice that you were able to meet with me. So I could have gotten up and left, but I chose to stay for another hour. And he told me all about his business. He gave me his business card and says, go and try to catch me. You'll never get me. I'm too insulated, too much corruption, too many bribes. You can't get anywhere close to me. And he kept saying to me, you guys are so ridiculous. You follow rules and regulations. I just make stuff up as I go. If anyone gets in my way, I take care of them. It was quite an interesting but scary discussion at the same time.
I understand. It must have been very scary, right? Okay, coming back, sir, you wrote this book called The Art of Inspirational Speaking, of Public Speaking.
Yes.
The Art of Inspirational Public Speaking. Because
Yes.
we are really enjoying speaking to you, and at the same time, we would want to know how to develop this art so that the flame can spark a flame.
Well, let me start by saying that I had a tremendous fear of public speaking for much of my life.
Okay.
I had an experience when I was in third grade and my teacher embarrassed me and I never wanted to get up. But about 15 years ago, I said, okay, I'm in development work. I have to get over this fear. So every time they said there's a talk, one of my hands would go up and the other one would try to pull it down, but I just kept doing presentations after presentations after presentations. But my philosophy, and it's written in that book, is that we really need to use stories to get our points across. How many of us have seen a slide deck that includes 35 slides, a title, and 7 bullets or 10 bullets, and then another one, and another one, and another one? So you present by just providing factual information. Our mind doesn't absorb that type of information. You take the same information and you put it into a story, all of a sudden the story is memorable. You remember the stories that I said in LinkedIn because all of the pieces are linked together. And as human beings, that's how we communicate. When you go home and talk to your family members, you don't give them bullet points. You say, this is what happened. I met so-and-so. We talked about this. You are telling a story. So the trick to good public speaking is to come up with good stories and tell them in order to get your points across.
Okay, I hope, in a gist, we can really catch up your, mantra of public speaking beautifully. So, Matt, coming to the question now, that because so far we have tried to get, how big is the problem and your beautiful art of storytelling. So, but what is your story? And now you're living in Hong Kong, but what I am perceiving that you are an Australian, right?
No, I'm an American.
American, and then how did you travel the world? I mean, because you have traveled Southeast Asia, then Vietnam, Cambodia, and then now you're in Hong Kong. And why now Hong Kong?
Yeah, well, actually what happened is I went to Nepal thinking I would be there for 1 year, and 31 years later, I'm still in Asia. So I spent 8 years in Nepal, 5 years in Bangladesh, 10 years in Thailand, and now I'm in Hong Kong. But I visited 72 countries and worked in about 45 countries. So when you work for the US government or the United Nations or do the job that I do at the Mekong Club, we often get invited to do consultations, talks, to set up programs, to evaluate things. And so I've had the great honor to visit many, many locations around the world.
But you started your life as a public health officer. You went to Nepal, right? And so you were currently working at that time for the UN.
USAID, yes.
US, and after that,
USAID.
Started working for the UN.
Yeah, and I ran kind of one of the largest UN programs in the world that had offices in China, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar.
Now you no longer work for the UN?
I don't work with them anymore. I started up an organization called the Mekong Club. We work with the private sector to help them to understand the issue of human trafficking. About a year ago, I worked with banks in India, helping them to understand the vulnerability that they have to allowing money that comes from criminal activity associated with human trafficking, to help them to identify how to find it and stop it from making it into the banks. So we work with the private sector to address modern slavery because the private sector is often closer to the money and more vulnerable if something happens related to modern slavery in them.
The private sector is more closer to the money earned through human trafficking, but the private sector is also the sector which has the least social responsibility when it comes, because they want to just make more profits and they're not having any ethics. So why would any private sector, I feel that, want to work on humanitarian ethics unless they are really backed by such principles and morals?
That's a very good question, and this is my answer to that, because I believe that for many years. But let's say I get in front of a group of 100 private sector people. At the end of that talk, 10 people will come up to me and say, oh my gosh, something about this issue, it makes me cry, it makes my heart feel like it's so heavy, what can I do to help? Those are the people we work with in the private sector, because they are in those companies and they will identify other people like themselves. And then once we have enough of those people, then we are asked to come in and provide support for them. So you're right, there are a lot of private companies that are selfish and perhaps almost greedy, but there's also good people within the private sector too. You just have to find those people, empower those people, help those people, and have those people be your ambassadors within those organizations.
So I'm over from my part. I really enjoyed talking to you, speaking your views. I'm really feeling inspired, like I'm feeling inspired through your stories on LinkedIn. And I wish the universe and the Almighty Om to provide more power to you in your this pursuit for I mean, child slavery less or a human traffic less society that you are pursuing to, give us. So kudos to you from my part.
Yeah, I just want to say I actually have a book that's based in India coming out in about a month. It's a novel this time, and it's based on the stories that you see in LinkedIn tied together, a mosaic. It's called in the Dancing in the Light of the Moon. It's based on 20 years of research. Once it comes out, I'd be happy to send you a copy.
Thank you so much. Dancing in the Light of Moon. I'm just writing it down. I'll be happy to connect you to a lot of publishers over here in Delhi, because I've not been much outside Delhi. That can, help spread your words. Like the Bhari Simpson Khan market, that's very famous.
Yeah, I have a couple of other novels that were done by Vikas and Pilgrims in India. So, I published 13 books on various things. And so I believe, and this goes back to the storytelling, that using stories and drama in film also, you have films in India that look at this topic, is a good way of helping to educate people about the issue.
Yeah, 13 books is a big number. I only knew about 3 of your books.
So, yeah, well, I mean, I don't say that I'm a great author. I just like to write. So anyways, I really appreciate you reaching out to me. And if there's anything I can do to help you or your audience, please don't hesitate to contact me through LinkedIn.
I will surely. One question that I was bothering is because you have been working in the Southeast Asia, but what I believe is, much of the Southeast Asia is not very different from each other. I'm sure Bangladesh and Nepal has a very same society or a cultural thing that is in India. Did you find any difference?
Not really. In fact, I find the same characteristics in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, East Asia, even the United States, UK, and Australia. The traffickers are consistently using the same processes and procedures all over the world, whether it's, it doesn't matter what kind of country you're in, they seem to have the same tricks and deceptive ways. So, my understanding of India, having been there. Actually, my kids are half Indian, so I know the culture quite well. Is that there are some really amazingly talented, creative, compassionate, kind, loving, impactful people there. And if those people could be incentivized to step up and get more involved in helping to be a part of the solution, amazing things could happen, like that rape case that took place where, the medical student on the bus was raped, and then the entire country stood up and said, we need to stop this type of thing. The same thing can happen there. It can happen all over the world. This is what I'm striving to do as part of the work that I'm doing. Is to ignite that
Yes.
passion and that desire to help.
Yes, Nirbhaya, you are talking about Nirbhaya case. That was really very shocking and horrific to all of us. Hey, speaking of the record,
Yes.
I have heard that your wife won the documentary award for the long road travel or some book that or some documentary movie that she made. She's Indian?
No, my second wife. My second wife is Korean. My first wife was Indian. My wife is a documentary person. She's been an anchor. She has also written a book that addresses modern slavery.
Yes.
And her links, Sylvia U. Friedman. And if you look at her posts on LinkedIn, she gets like 10,000 likes because she's an amazing writer. And she's an amazing human being. And we actually do road trips. We're doing a road trip across Canada together, 20 days of just doing talks, and then we'll do it in the United States. We've done it in Bangladesh. We've done it in Sri Lanka. We've done it in New Zealand, Australia. It's something that we do. One of these days we'll do it in India. We haven't done it there yet, but we will for sure.
I think that's the source of your creativity. That's how you learn or introspect in your creativity travels.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Anyone who has an opportunity to travel should take advantage of it.
Yeah.
That's when you see yourself from a different perspective, because you have to adjust to a completely different culture. And it helps us to grow as human beings.
Yes, thank you. This was just a off the record thing. I will edit this. And once again, I will say a thank you very much for connecting with me.
It doesn't matter. You can keep it in. I don't care. It doesn't make any difference to me.
Yeah, I will stay connected to you, Matt, and it has been really wonderful. And the kind of work that you are doing, we look up to you. Thank you so much once again, sir.
Well, I feel the same way about you. You're a hero. Just to be interviewing somebody like me, keep doing what you're doing, and it's really going to make a difference.
Thank you so much once again.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.